Hello and welcome back to the Karma Stories podcast. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have 3 stories for you from the Malicious Compliance subreddit. The Karma Stories podcast is published to all major podcasting platforms, and you can also read along on YouTube under our @Karma Stories podcast handle. If you have a story you'd like to submit to the podcast, you can do so by email at karmastoriespod@gmail.com. Before we start, a quick announcement that I have just added a whole bunch of new dragons and other products to my 3D printing store. You can jump on and check them out for yourself at dangly3d.com. Link in description of both YouTube and the podcast. Alright, on to today's stories. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from Minerva JB. You want me to escalate a claim? Sure. I used to work on the retentions department of an ISP back in the day. While many people called genuinely wanting to cancel their phone service, just as many knew that retentions was more than that. The ISP, let's call them Red Phone, had 2 different departments. I worked on Retentions 1, where we did a lot of fixing bills and offering small discounts and slightly cheaper phones to customers who said they wanted to leave. Retentions 2 was for customers who were in the process of porting their numbers. And the worst thing they offered was a 50% discount for a couple of years with a decent phone for free. This happened roughly 10, maybe 12 years ago when roaming was straight up highway robbery. Let me introduce you to the executive. I got the call. I did my little introductory spiel and I immediately discovered this guy was the most entitled POS I'd ever had the displeasure to speak to. He said he was a very important executive who traveled a lot for work, but the bill he got was ridiculous, and I had to solve it or he was going to cancel his service. I muted him so he heard nothing, but I could still hear what he said, and while I checked his account, I could hear him gloat to his girlfriend that he's getting the bill credited because he knows how to play the system. And he was a butthole, but he wasn't wrong. This guy was a pro at playing Red Phone. He had the highest phone plan the company offered, which was around 90 euros at the time for one line, but paid 30 euros per month because he had discounts from both departments stacked on top of each other. His plan allowed him to get what at the time was a super expensive phone for basically nothing at Retentions 2. He'd gotten the super shiny customer status and the super shiny customer service line, which usually meant a customer was averaging a 300 euro monthly bill, despite his 30 euro bill, because he complained about how the delocalized customer service sucked. He was also not wrong about his bill being ridiculous. He'd visited several European countries, got a 600 euro bill, called customer service, and said he had not known that roaming was so expensive. No one had warned him when he told us he was traveling overseas. The company had a policy that the first time a customer complained about something, we could refund them, particularly if the complaint was that the customer had not been informed about extra charges. So the rep informed him about roaming costs and refunded him all of the roaming charges, leaving the bill at 30 euro. Second month comes around, he kept using the phone overseas, got a 1500 euro bill. He calls customer service. They tell him they can't refund him again. He says he wants to cancel his account then and gets transferred to me. He was demanding that we credited his roaming charges again because if we can do it once, we can do it again. And also because roaming prices were abusive. He did have a point there. I told him I couldn't do that, so he wanted me to open a claim and escalate it. I refused again because there was no one to escalate to. He wasn't going to get that credited. He insisted he wasn't hanging up until I escalated the issue because he wasn't informed. And if I kept the call going for much longer, he was going to charge the company for his time because he was a busy man. At this point, I'd been working there long enough that if you were nice or even normal, I would try my darndest to help you. But if you were a dick, sorry, can't do, get lost. Customer refuses to hang up, I can hang up. This guy though, he'd gone past being a dick into total sea waffle, and I was pissed off. I couldn't be a dick back, but he'd been effing around, and I could make sure he found out. So I told him that, okay, since he was so insistent I would open a claim to refund him the €1,500 bill, and muted him while I opened the claim. The butthole was again gloating at his girlfriend about how clever he was because he was going to get his bill refunded too. Meanwhile, I was copy-pasting the notes from the previous month's claim where the rep had written, "I've informed the customer of roaming charges in all the countries he told me he could be visiting," a list of European countries. Also, stacking discounts, very much not a thing. He had to spam the Retention 1 call centers with calls until he got a newbie lost enough to apply another discount over his Retentions 2 discount. And he had not read the terms and conditions of the accounts, but I had. Trying to defraud the company was grounds for service termination. I got the claim number, flagged down my supervisor, and told her to please send it to headquarters in the daily report so fraud could examine the account. I told the guy that the claim had been opened, but also that since it was obvious he was trying to abuse the company's policies, the claim had been flagged to be reviewed by fraud, and it was likely his account would be terminated. He went from entitled to worried in 2 seconds, and asked me to close the claim. Sorry dude, can't do. You wanted a claim open? Now it's open. Yes, the customer was fired. We're gonna jump into the comments of this one for another very similar story. This one's from a user called Frigoff and it says, 20 plus years ago, I worked at a call center in Canada dealing with a US cellular company, and roaming was a massive problem. There were areas along the Gulf Coast where you could pick up a tower that was out in the Gulf, but the charges on it were basically $3.25 a minute. Well, we had many people upset over that. And like in OP's tale, we would credit them once and teach them to look for the word roam on the top of their phone. But if it happened again, they were responsible for the charges. Sometimes we'd get people who had incurred charges for just a few minutes the second time, and if it was under $25, we would generally do it as we could see they were making an effort to avoid the charges. My absolute favorite of the charged roaming and shouldn't have been customers was a woman who wanted to know why she had charges when her plan included the whole US. When I checked her bill, yep, the whole US is covered. However, the 3 Canadian provinces she spent time in weren't covered. So when I explained this to her, she told me that Canada was one of the 50 states. I was dumbfounded by this, so I explained that it wasn't, that Canada is a different country. She called me stupid. I explained that I was in Canada at that very moment, and she demanded a supervisor, as when she was educated, Canada was one of the states, and I was obviously not fit for my position. She went from me to my supervisor, to their supervisor, to the project director, to the site director, and still didn't believe any of us that Canada wasn't a state. We refused to credit the charges for her, $900+, and when she screamed she would just cancel the service, we informed her she would still be responsible for the charges and would have an early termination fee of $200 per line. She had 5. She cursed and swore so much that one of the supervisors that was listening to the call, not for coaching but entertainment at the scenario, came over and just disconnected the call. All of us documented the account, site director approved immediate cancellation of her lines as she requested, and due to her verbal abuse of staff. I feel sorry for whoever got her when she called back in about 5 minutes, but I checked that account for a few months, she never got a credit or paid it. It got sent to collections for total charges over $3,500. And when she called us back about it, we refused to discuss with her and told her she needed to call the collection agency. I got one of those calls, and I'm sure she could hear the crap-eating grin on my face during the whole call. I love stories like this where people think they're going to get whatever they want from a company, but they're belligerent about it and it just doesn't go their way. In fact, they do get a promotion, but they're promoted to the competitor's problem. I've worked in about 8 different call centers over the years. Yeah, don't judge me. And the rules are usually that they let the customers walk all over the agents on the phone, and the customers pretty much get whatever they want. So in this case, being able to tell the customer to pound sand, that is absolutely wonderful to me. This story comes to us from Runner Dan. You work 8 hours a day and that's it. I was a developer for a large financial services company, and because we lacked many tools, I was usually tasked with building various tools, scripts, reports, etc. to help automate the environment, and really just worked around the inadequacies of our off-the-shelf tools. At my peak, I probably had around 300 apps and/or scripts in production. Due to the number of asks from leadership and to keep the lights on, I usually booked anywhere from 4 to 10 hours of overtime per week. After about a year, I got a new boss who decided she would ensure that I take no overtime for any reason. She proclaimed that I would only be allowed to work 8 hours per day and not a moment more. No exceptions. I wasn't a full-time employee, so I didn't have any grounds to push back. I usually started at 8, so with my 30-minute lunch, that meant my new hours were 8 to 4:30. Flash forward to later that same week, an upstream system changed their data feed and it corrupted one of our downstream systems. Stuff like this happened often enough that I had translation tools built to resolve any of those feed-related issues, but even then, I still had to spend a few minutes figuring out what changed in order to adjust my own code. Anyway, as the operations have come to a halt, my boss and her boss are looking over my shoulder as I'm diagnosing the feed problem, which I found pretty quickly. The clock strikes 4:30 and I lock my computer, stand up from my desk and say, well, it's 4:30, that's my 8 hours, I'll see you tomorrow, and walk out. The look of confusion, rage, and exasperation was just chef's kiss. At this point, all of our overnight backups have stopped and will not run until I resolve things. This means a global financial institution no longer has any data backups being made for that entire night, and will be completely screwed if, well, anything happens. Flash forward to the next morning as I walk to my desk at 7:56 a.m., as I made sure to never be in a situation where I could be called out as coming in late. My boss's boss is waiting for me. He directs me into his office and very calmly says, moving forward, I'll manage your timesheet and you can take as many hours as you need. I left that job about 4 to 5 months later, and the entire building was laid off about 2 months after that. Only 2 of about 200 people weren't laid off, and one of those people was the guy I hired to backfill me, as someone had to keep all the code running. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called the Old Man 1313. It says, I love the managers that think there's nothing more important in life than eliminating overtime. They are always good for entertainment. I think OP missed a major opportunity here because it was plainly obvious to upper management how important OP was, and they were allowed to keep working overtime. I think it was time for OP to negotiate their salary at that point, or at least negotiate their overtime rate, because if I'm that important that you're going to let me work overtime again, well, better make it worth my while. This story comes to us from Weep Ninny Bong. Boss doesn't understand Outlook. Happened over a decade ago before workplace chats were a regular thing. My boss at the time was an old timer. I'm pretty sure he was past his retirement age. No grudge against that. He was very good at most aspects of his job, just set in his older ways. Often, I would have to call a meeting with our colleagues in Japan, with him included. For various reasons, he would get upset if I scheduled these without talking to him first about his schedule, even though his calendar showed him as free. He insisted that I have to check in directly with him in his office. The problem is, he wasn't always there. So what I would do was just send him an Outlook meeting invite to just him and him alone for the time I proposed to have this meeting. It was convenient because I was already looking at his availability in Outlook. He could accept if he works, and then I could update the meeting with everyone else needed. He sees this and hollers at me to go to his office. He's a pretty big, loud dude, so everyone in my vicinity hears. He proceeds to ream me out for not doing what he asked. I'm sure he didn't understand that he was the only one on the invite, and he wasn't appearing to decline the meeting in front of anyone. I tried to explain, but then proceeds to say under no circumstances should I book a meeting with him without chatting with him in person. Sure enough, a day or two later, a very important meeting request comes through for that afternoon with some higher ups, and he's not around for me to talk to as it was later in the day. My manager's number 2, who heard the minor fiasco above, takes me aside and says, "I know what he just yelled at you about, but I think you should just book that meeting. He didn't even need to be there, it was just proper for him to attend." Needless to say, I didn't, quoting what Bossman said, and that meeting never happened that day. I vaguely remember him losing a few points for not being able to have this meeting, but nothing nuclear. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called Emax4. It says, "You did the right thing. Boss should have understood at his age and position that actions have consequences. I'd leave him brochures for night classes at the local community college regarding Microsoft Office training." Yeah, I don't think I agree with that commenter because, they're just going to take a look at those brochures and go, "Oh, I'm too important and I don't have time for that." And they're going to end up in the garbage or recycle. Sometimes you just can't teach an old dog new tricks, and this sounds like the kind of guy that would print out emails just to have a physical copy. If you enjoy daily Reddit stories, I encourage you to follow and add us to your favorites on whichever podcasting platform you enjoy the most. And if you're watching and listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video. It really helps us out. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.